It happened when I was 21, during the summer I stayed at my aunt and uncle's house in Vermont. I was supposed to help take care of their dog while they went on a 2-week trip to Europe. Their house was an old Victorian-style home, the kind that creaks and groans with every gust of wind. It had 3 floors, plus an attic and a basement, though I only ever used the first 2 floors and rarely ventured into the basement, which smelled of mildew and had always creeped me out. I'd been there before for family holidays and visits, but I'd never spent much time alone in the house. My aunt warned me about the noises the house made, trying to reassure me that it was just old and full of character. She said it almost like a joke, but I could tell she was serious, almost like she didn't want me to be surprised by the strange sounds I'd hear at night. The first few days were uneventful. I went about my routine, feeding and walking Duke, their golden retriever, and spending my downtime reading or scrolling through my phone. The house felt a little too quiet without my aunt and uncle around, but I didn't mind it. It was peaceful. That peace didn't last. It started on the 4th night. I was lying in bed in the guest room, scrolling through social media, when I heard a faint knocking sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. Maybe a branch tapping against the window, or Duke knocking something over downstairs. I shrugged it off and went back to scrolling. But then it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It wasn't coming from the window or downstairs. It was coming from above me. I froze, staring at the ceiling. The knocks weren't random. They had a rhythm, almost like someone was knocking on a door. The attic was right above the guest room, but as far as I knew, the attic was just a storage space for old furniture and boxes. There wasn't supposed to be anyone up there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Houses make noise, right? Old pipes, expanding wood, that sort of thing. I turned up the volume on my phone and tried to ignore it. But the knocking didn't stop. If anything, it got louder. Duke, who had been lying on the floor at the foot of my bed, suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, and he stared intently at the ceiling, his tail motionless. A low growl rumbled from his throat. My heart sank. If Duke was reacting to it, that meant it wasn't just my imagination. I forced myself out of bed and opened the door to the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the old house. The air felt heavier somehow, like the house was holding its breath. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stood at the base of the attic stairs. The door to the attic was closed, and the thought of opening it made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no one up there. I'd check the attic, find nothing, and laugh about it later. With a deep breath, I climbed the narrow staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. When I reached the top, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets and stacks of cardboard boxes. The beam of my flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. I scanned the room, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the old wooden floor. The air was thick, suffocating, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I moved the flashlight around the room, checking behind the furniture and inside the larger boxes. Nothing. Just as I was starting to feel a little foolish, I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a door. A door I didn't remember ever seeing before. The door was small, almost child-sized, with peeling white paint and a rusted handle. It didn't make sense. I'd been in this attic before, and I was certain there had never been a door there. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door slowly, the floorboards creaking with every step. When I reached it, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The paint around the edges of the door was scratched and chipped, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way inside. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, and I hesitated before turning it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but what I could see sent chills down my spine. The room was empty except for a single wooden chair in the center. The chair faced the far wall, where strange symbols were carved into the wood. They looked old, almost ancient, and I couldn't make sense of them. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the attic, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A low, guttural voice, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam swung wildly, illuminating the chair as it began to rock slowly back and forth. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back in the guest room with the door locked and Duke by my side. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone as I dialed my uncle's number. When he finally answered, I was nearly in tears as I told him what had happened. My uncle was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice that door," he said, his voice grim. He went on to explain that the house had a history, one they rarely spoke about. The attic had once been used by a previous owner for rituals. He didn't know the details, but strange things had been reported by nearly every family that had lived there. "I'm sorry," he said. "We should have warned you." I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I packed my things and left. My aunt and uncle apologized profusely when they returned, but I never went back to that house. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the door and the symbols carved into the wall. I wonder what they meant and whether the whispers I heard were just the beginning. I hope I never find out. It happened when I was 19, during my sophomore year of college. My parents were out of town for the weekend, visiting my grandparents in upstate New York. I stayed behind to study for midterms, although I had to admit, the prospect of having the house to myself for a few days was enticing. I could study at my own pace, take breaks whenever I wanted, and even blast music without bothering anyone. It sounded like the perfect setup. Our house was relatively large, 2 stories, a basement, and an attic. It sat on the edge of a quiet, wooded neighborhood, where the nearest neighbor was a good 3-minute walk away. I'd grown up there and always felt safe. That sense of safety, however, would vanish by the end of that weekend. It was Friday night, and I was sitting in the den on the first floor, surrounded by textbooks, sticky notes, and half-empty coffee mugs. The den was cozy, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk, and a large bay window that overlooked the backyard. The only light came from my desk lamp and the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Around 10 p.m., I decided to take a break. I left my books and wandered into the kitchen to grab a snack. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps overhead. At first, I froze, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling, or the wind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, heavier this time. Someone, or something, was moving around upstairs. My stomach tightened. I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen drawer and cautiously made my way to the base of the stairs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. I tried to steady my breathing and told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just the wind rattling something loose. Still, I decided to check. Step by step, I climbed the staircase, the knife gripped tightly in my hand. The hallway upstairs was dark, save for a faint sliver of moonlight seeping through the window at the end. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have blown out. Great. I stood there for a moment, listening. The house was eerily quiet. Maybe I imagined the sound. I forced myself to walk down the hallway, checking each room as I went. My parents' bedroom? Empty. My room? Empty. The guest room? Empty. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a little foolish. It was just my nerves, I told myself. I'd been on edge from studying too hard. Satisfied that I was alone, I returned to the den and tried to focus on my textbooks. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Every creak of the house made me jump. I started to regret staying home alone. Then, around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't coming from upstairs. They were coming from below me, the basement. My heart stopped. The basement door was just down the hall, and I could see it from where I sat. It was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I had closed it earlier. I grabbed my knife again and slowly approached the door. My hands were trembling as I pushed it open. The basement light switch was at the top of the stairs. I flipped it on, and the single bulb at the bottom flickered weakly to life. The stairs descended into the kind of darkness that made your skin crawl. Every instinct in my body told me not to go down there, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was in my house. "Who's down there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I waited for a few seconds, but the silence was suffocating. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, one slow step at a time. The basement was unfinished, a large, open space with concrete floors and exposed beams. At the far end was a small crawl space, just big enough for someone to squeeze into. The light bulb above me buzzed faintly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. No intruder, no sign of forced entry. Just boxes of old junk and cobweb-covered furniture. I was about to turn around and head back upstairs when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The crawlspace door was open. It wasn't wide open, just enough to reveal the pitch-black void inside. I stared at it, frozen. My parents always kept it locked. Always. A faint, metallic smell wafted from the opening, and I suddenly felt lightheaded. I didn't want to know what was inside, but some twisted sense of curiosity drove me forward. "Is someone in there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the darkness of the crawlspace, I heard a sound that I will never forget. A low, raspy whisper. "Come closer." I dropped the knife. I don't even remember doing it. My instincts took over, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it and backed away, my chest heaving. My mind was racing. What did I just hear? Was someone down there? Or was I losing my mind? I ran to the living room, grabbed my phone, and called the police. The operator tried to keep me calm, but I could barely form a coherent sentence. All I could say was that someone was in my house. The officers arrived within minutes. They searched the entire house, including the basement and the crawl space, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. They assured me it was probably just my imagination and suggested I stay somewhere else for the night. I called my friend Emily and asked if I could crash at her place. She didn't hesitate to say yes. The next morning, I returned to the house with my parents. I told them everything, but they were skeptical. My dad joked that I'd been studying too hard and needed a break. But when we checked the crawl space together, we found something that wiped the smirk off his face. Inside, scrawled on the wall in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "See you soon." We never figured out who, or what, was responsible. My dad installed new locks on all the doors and windows, and we stopped using the basement for storage. I moved out the following year, but every time I visit my parents, I can't help but glance at the basement door, half expecting to hear those footsteps again. I live in a modest, two-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where you hear birds chirping in the morning and crickets at night. My parents both work late shifts, so being home alone isn't exactly unusual for me. I'm 26 now, but this happened about 3 years ago when I was still in college. It was a summer evening, and I had just returned from my part-time job at a bookstore. My parents wouldn't be home until after midnight, so I decided to unwind by binge-watching a new crime series. My living room has a large window that faces the front yard, and while I was sitting on the couch, I could see the soft glow of the streetlights outside. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I first noticed something strange. As I got up to grab a snack from the kitchen, I thought I saw movement in the front yard. I paused and squinted through the window, but all I could see was the dimly lit street and the outline of the hedge separating our yard from the neighbors. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I returned to the couch and tried to focus on the show. About 20 minutes later, I felt it again. The undeniable sensation of being watched. You know that feeling, when the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end? It wasn't just the show getting to me. This was different. I glanced at the window and froze. There was a silhouette, a person, standing motionless just beyond the hedges. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor out for a walk, but why would they just stand there? My heart was racing, but I didn't want to overreact. I turned off the TV and the lights in the living room, hoping the darkness would make me less visible. Then I crept to the window for a better look. The figure was still there, but now they were closer, just at the edge of the lawn. They weren't moving, just standing, staring. My mouth went dry. I couldn't make out any details. The shadows obscured their features. I grabbed my phone and dialed my dad's number, but it went straight to voicemail. I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? That someone was standing outside? Instead, I texted my friend Liam, who lived a few blocks away. He replied quickly, "That's creepy. Want me to come over?" I told him no at first, thinking I was overreacting. But then, I heard it. A faint tap on the window. I nearly dropped my phone. My stomach churned as I stared at the window, where the figure now stood inches from the glass. I could just barely make out their face, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into their skull. They didn't knock again, just stared. My breath caught in my throat as they raised a hand and waved. I bolted upstairs to my room, locked the door, and texted Liam in a panic. "Come now. Someone's outside." He didn't reply immediately, and those minutes felt like hours. I turned off all the lights and crouched by the bed, trying to stay out of sight. My ears strained for any sound from downstairs. Then, I heard the back door creak open. I was certain I had locked it, but maybe I hadn't. My heart pounded as I listened to the soft shuffle of footsteps on the hardwood floor. Whoever it was, they were inside now. My hands trembled as I texted Liam again. "They're in the house. Call the police." I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps grew louder as they ascended the stairs. Each creak of the wooden steps felt like a countdown to my doom. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. I covered my mouth to stifle a sob as the doorknob rattled. They were trying to get in. Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. Headlights illuminated the front of the house, and I heard a man's voice yelling, "Hey, who's there?" It was Liam. The doorknob stopped rattling, and I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the stairs. By the time I mustered the courage to peek out of my window, the figure was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the night. When Liam came inside, we searched the house together, but there was no sign of forced entry. The back door was locked, just as I had left it. Nothing was stolen, and there was no trace of the intruder. It was as if they had never been there at all. The police arrived shortly after, but without any evidence or witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. They chalked it up to a prowler and advised me to keep my doors locked and my phone handy. But I knew it wasn't just a prowler. The way they stood there, watching me, felt deliberate, personal. I've since moved out of that house, but I'll never forget the hollow, unblinking eyes that stared through my window that night. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if Liam hadn't shown up when he did.